that we would ban all gated communities. So the motion assumes this fiat exists. I don't know either how you can make something the case all over a continent, but like I didn't come up with this. It's not my problem. So cool beans. Now, what do we think the benefits of this are going to be? So we think first this will lead to a better provisioning of public services. What are we talking about here? Like electricity, like water, like waste collections, like ambulances, possibly like schools. Okay, if there's another clarification, CO, go.
Just a small thing. What's the punishment going to be?
We'll probably enforce this with the police. And if you don't abide by this, we fine you 10% of your yearly income, for every infraction or something like that. We give you like a grace period. I don't know. Look, there's reasonable ways this can be done. I don't think this is where the debate meets its end. Okay, cool. So the current problem with public services is that the people most able to pay for these services, e.g., that would pay the highest taxes, and the people with the best political connections and the best capacity to lobby government to build more public services, now get their services privately delivered. And as a result, this means the rest of society doesn't have enough political capital, doesn't have enough organizing capacity to get anything built. The other problem is that something that is quite common throughout gated communities all over South America is that they have their own legal municipal authorities and therefore are allowed to collect local taxes themselves. This means the taxes that emanate from these regions then don't go back to the municipal governments that otherwise would need them because they end up being centralized within gated communities. What changes now? Now, if rich people want to have good access to electricity, water, and ambulances, they have to make sure that the public services that everyone has access to become good enough that they're acceptable to the rich. So they will do things like lobby their state government to do better. They will things like use their connections in government, especially in countries that deal to some extent with corruption and are often run on informal patronage networks. Rich people will be able to have far more sway with the Minister of Energy to make sure that power lines actually get built out to the regions where they are needed to. But thirdly, this also means these people are simply willing to pay higher taxes in order to support the provisioning of these public services. Also, importantly, they're willing to pay taxes to a joint municipal government to begin with, which is something that oftentimes doesn't happen in the status quo. We think this itself shows in an even more pronounced manner when you talk about security. So something that is quite common all across South America. Also, just important to note, this debate isn't about Central America, and it's not about Mexico, where you have the highest death rate. But if you look at Guatemala or Peru, obviously these countries aren't as safe as Norway, but none of them have pronounced continuously very high rates of homicide or drug wars happening. So I don't think that there's a continuous crisis of public safety in most of the countries that we're talking about here. And yes, you can say Colombia, but yes, that's also your only example. That doesn't work in the debate. Nevertheless, there might be, to some extent, rich people that fear the rest of society and that are very anxious about this. In the status quo, they just create a lot of private security services. Now they have to make sure that the police actually works. Now serious lobbying effort is thrown behind making the police less corrupt, making sure that the police does the bidding of their citizens. And even more importantly, this means that if you're super concerned about gang violence, you actually want the police to clean up the rest of the city. You want the police to create security and stability, even in the less fortunate parts of town, because this is where organized crime presumably emanates from. Lastly, we also think that this in general creates more class mixing and less prejudice within society overall. What currently happens is that you have an almost complete separation of the lives of the rich people and the rest of society, which means that the stereotypes that you hold and the prejudices that they have almost fully inform what you think poor people look like and what they live like, because you almost never see them apart from the evening news, when sensationalized reports about crime give you a distorted image of what it is like to be in society. We force people to live closer together and realize they aren't so different after all. Life can be peaceful, it can be cooperative, and all without gated communities. Please propose.
Okay, I want to thank the speaker for the speech, and I would like to give the floor to the first speaker of opening opposition here.
Am I audible? Okay. No, where's my result sheet? God damn it. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, first I want to clear what Gov can fiat here and what they can't fiat here. What a gated community specifically is, as written in the motion clarification, is it's a residential community where there's a wall around it. This doesn't mean that you get the electricity from somewhere else. This doesn't mean that you get your water from somewhere else. This just means that you yourself are like protected and can like stay outside with security guards and make sure that crime doesn't come in, right? I think secondly, though, this probably still means that you like pay taxes because you're still part of a municipal government, right? Like OG has to explain to me why it's specific that a gated community is just like a state within the state that does independently all their things. This is presumably not what happens. It's probably also very hard for like a very few amount of people to have their own electricity building or their own water building or whatever. This is probably just not reasonable to assume that this is how anything works. But I think secondly, even in the best case scenario, you have a collective action problem about the police on both sides of the house, because you still need to bring like your robber that you caught to the police. You can't just do vigilante justice, right? So if the police is corrupt, they're corrupt on both sides of the house, and like if they're not corrupt, but they're probably corrupt, right? So I think this basically like knocks out a lot of OT. The case from OO will be why it's justified specifically in this case to have a gated community that protects you, and it's justified to take away this like communal living space. Where gated communities probably happen. I think they probably only happen in the worst cases, right? For 3 reasons. Firstly, they're really expensive. You have to pay a lot of security guards, you have to pay a lot of like upkeep and shit like that. So you probably only do it if it's really necessary, right? I think the second thing is you also have less access to stuff in the public. So you need to go to the shops outside the gated community. That's a bit of a nuisance. You don't want that if it's not necessary. Thirdly, you're probably being looked weirdly at when you go out of the gated community because you're not part of the other community. Given that people hate ostracization, people hate being looked at weirdly, this probably also only happens in like the worst cases. What about South America? I think sure, yes, it's not like the super worst case, but there's still flawed democracies, right? You still probably have police being bribed. You still probably have like some bad public safety stuff. You probably still have some sort of gang, simply because in countries where you have like poor people and people who maybe make some money off of drugs or make some money off of like organized criminalization, people are more likely to opt into this because they're poor and have very little other choices. Meaning that at the point where you still have inequality and favelas, crime probably still exists, and there's probably still a threat to specifically people who walk on the streets, to specifically women, children who want to play on the streets, who want to go home at night. Who specifically is in a gated community? It's probably not just the super rich, right? It's probably like as soon as you can afford it, you want your children to be there in a safe community. You want your children to like grow up playing on the street. You want your like daughter when she comes home at night to not be like assaulted, right? So this probably means that you have a lot of people, like a significant amount of people who are like medium level rich, who can afford this to still do. What also doesn't change is specifically that rich people will have also not that big of an incentive to like lobby the government police-wise, because on both sides of the house, rich people can still like have security cameras on there. This is not banned by government model. I also don't think they have fear to ban like all private security cameras, meaning that you can still protect yourself when you're mega rich. This is specifically about what happens on the streets, which is a public space, which is where this debate happens. Why is it a legit form of self-defense and legit to like take away this public space? Firstly, I think it's legit if there's no other form of like community protection that you can do. At the point where your state has failed you and where you cannot trust them anymore, this is the only thing this is the only thing you do. Given that I think that like you probably do this only when the state has failed you, it's probably very justified. Given that you only give the like mandate of like violence and power to the state in return of actually being protected. At the point where the state doesn't fulfill this responsibility anymore to protect you from criminals and shit like that, you are like justified to take that in your own hands and try to protect yourself in a way that also doesn't harm other people. Because specifically in this gated community, it's just we keep people out. This isn't an infringement on anyone's like this isn't like vigilante justice, right? Given that, it's probably justified to do that. Also because your first like mandate to that who you have to protect is towards yourself and the people most proximate to you, your family. Given that you like through this you can fulfill that. This is like first just a justified form of this sort of self-protection. But the second point is that you're also justified in taking away this like space that is generally public, which is the streets, because that is where the debate is happening, right? I think that the problem here is this presumes that the space is public in the first place. At the point where you have people extorting you, at the point where you have gangs like fighting on the street, this doesn't just happen in Central America. This like fucking happens in Vienna, right? And Vienna is the most biblical city in the world. This is very justified to assume. At the point where that happens and where you're not safe at night anymore, you're technically not taking away a public space because that has already been claimed by like violent actors who want to like hurt you. Before I go on with your explanation, CG.
Yeah, so you begin by explaining that not a lot of people are going to go there because these communities are really expensive to build. But then you go on to say that actually a majority of the middle class is going to engage in these gated communities. How do these things sit together?
Okay, I think firstly, like even if not the whole middle class is in there, it's probably still some rich people. I think secondly, the specific difference here is it's expensive, so you only do it if it's necessary. But it's the first thing you invest in when you have some sort of money, because the most important thing to you is the safety of yourself and your family, because those are the most proximate people to you. That means that people are willing to spend that kind of money in the first place. Cool. Thanks for that for the clarification. Okay. I think then that means that at the point where you cannot enjoy the like freedom of a public space anymore, where you infringe on by like cartels fighting, you're justified in taking away that public space through like other people in order to give it back to at least some other people, because at least some people having the public space is better than no one having the public space, which is what government has to do. I also think this is specifically a bit better at curbing like crime in the first place, because at the point where you have like an entry point where people have to come in and pass through, it's easier to like catch criminals. It's easier to have some sort of general observation, which means that on the margins you probably still even get more protection of the general public, because you have some sort of general observation of people who want to come into this gated community to commit a crime, which means that it's marginally also better for everyone. Given that this is justified and that it's like better on the margins for everyone, proud to oppose.
I want to thank the speaker for the speech. I'd like to give the floor to the second speaker of opening government here.
Great. I'll take POIs in chat, please. Thank you. First, I'm going to talk about security and social services. Then I'll talk about social integration and politics. Firstly, on security. Opening op says that rich people are able to pay for protection in gated communities, and they should be able to. Two problems with this. The first is I question why rich people deserve this protection more than anyone else. As Sam characterizes, many of these people got their wealth and their ability to live in that gated community through plundering resources, through siphoning money from their constituents, through factories that keep people poor and vulnerable and working in sweatshops for 10 hours a day, or they got it from generational wealth that stemmed from colonialism. None of this inherently entitles you to protection over someone else. None of that entitles you to ignore the social problems that are pervasive in your country so that you can live in your bubble of safety and security. There's this assumption from opening op that the middle class could just buy into gated communities, but there are two reasons why this isn't true. The first is that residents of gated communities have every incentive to jealously guard the property values in their own community because they want their houses to be as expensive as possible. So it's not like the average middle class Joe in a country where income inequality is incredibly rampant and the wealthiest 1% hold most of the wealth in the country. It's highly unlikely that you can just buy a house there. The second thing, though, is that there's a lot of social exclusion that happens in gated communities. So if you don't look like everyone else, if you're not white, if you're dark skinned, you won't get approval to live in that community. So lots of reasons that you can be excluded independent of income. Secondly, crime is a problem, but opening opposition probably far overstates the extent to which crime is a problem. Most homicides in these countries happen amongst organized gangs. They also say that rich people can still have security cameras and they can choose to walk on safe streets if they want to. The key thing here is that we're not denying that crime is an issue. We're denying the idea that your daughter is going to get assaulted every time she walks on the street in Rio. If crime was as bad as they said, then everyone in Brazil would just be dead or terribly traumatized. A lot of this sounds like gated community paranoia, not the actual reality in South American countries. We argue a couple of things, that when rich people are forced to use public services, they are likely going to help make things better, which is the direct flip of this argument. Firstly, because lots of these rich people are going to lobby. So when you previously had your own water supply, now you have to deal with the water that keeps getting shut off every 2 hours, you're more likely to turn around and lobby politicians to change that. And they might say, oh, but this benefit only affects rich people. But lots of these benefits, by their nature, have to affect everyone. If I build power lines to a certain area, everyone gets power. If I improve the security in a certain area, then everyone is entitled to better police protection. So I guess the middle class person that couldn't get into the gated community now has slightly better police in the city. They say that no, it's not empirically true that these places have their own services, but it just is, right? Because in order, the city probably likes this too, because you can take pressure off of the grid if I have my own generators. At a certain point, you might decide, now I don't have to drive through the favela, so I might as well just build a private school. There's nothing necessarily stopping them from developing these own services, and every incentive that they have to want to have them. Secondly, there are more taxes going to municipal governments. So the US has lots of gated communities that have their own tax collection regimes. The reason that a lot of gated communities in places like Brazil might not pay taxes is because you have all the richest people in one area in a very corrupt state where officials can very easily get paid off. So you just say, I want my own tax regime in this gated community, and then you don't have to pay tax to anything outside of there. Whereas if we ban gated communities, this can't happen. So you have the most high income individuals in the country then putting money into the municipal government. They have more capacity to help other people. Thirdly, politicians can no longer shut their eyes to issues. So many politicians that are supposed to serve the poor live in gated communities where they never see a poor person. So now you have more sensitivity to people who face lots of social problems when the people that are running the country are forced to interact with them. We're never going to fix everything. I'm not saying we're going to fix everything, but we can't allow people to keep living in bubbles. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
Sure. So when you're evaluating or debating a law, what is it that you should consider before you decide to put that law into practice?
You should consider the benefits and harms of the law. You need to tell me what I need to consider. We've explained why the benefits of this law outweigh the harms. So let's then talk about social integration. So OP might say that rich people live together anyways. There are a couple of reasons why gated communities make this far worse. Firstly, in a normal city, there are no walls. So you can basically live your whole life in a gated community and never leave because there are schools, there are electric generators, there are recreation centers, and you don't really have to go outside. The only dark-skinned people that you see in a gated community in Brazil are the army of servants that maintain your tennis courts. When you live in a city, on the other hand, you have to go to the coffee shop, you have to go on the subway, your kids tend to go to school with kids that are from different backgrounds, you have to walk on the street. So gated communities are literally a world where poverty does not exist. Even if in the real world, rich people can insulate themselves to some extent, they can't live in the same environment of manufactured perfection. Secondly, gated communities create a sense of paranoia about the outside that doesn't exist otherwise. So imagine you're inside these really thick walls that have barbed wire on them. There are fingerprint scanners on every house. There are private security motorcycles riding by your driveway every day. And anyone who looks like they don't belong is immediately escorted out. You then become afraid of stepping outside the gated community and walking down the street like anyone else. Your world becomes about us and them, where people outside your thick walls are dangerous and where you're always on edge when you think about life outside the gated community. Someone living on the Upper East Side in New York doesn't have the same thing because they still have to interact with the outside. This has very real social impacts, right? Firstly, it affects social interactions on an everyday level, including the aggressions that people like minorities might face from other people on the street. But secondly, it has very real political impacts, where a lot of populism and political ignorance is based on just a lack of interaction with other people. So when all the poor people in your life you think are dangerous because you've never seen a poor person, then doing things like drug addiction rehab through political processes is like far less popular. Or when all dark-skinned people you think are violent, then police brutality against them doesn't seem as horrible because you've never interacted with any of them on a personal level. But when you have interacted and integrated with people who are not like you, then you're more likely to be sympathetic towards them. The way in here is that we accept that some trade-offs will exist in terms of the security of people in gated communities. But our political impacts are far more important. Firstly, because they affect everyone in a constituency or everybody in the country. But secondly, because these impacts are more long-term. We're willing to sort of swallow the unfortunate harm of a politician's son getting kidnapped if that means that there's better police protection for 10 years down the line. Like, these things affect everybody and they affect them indefinitely, or at least until the next political cycle, which is far more than opposition gets. Very proud to propose.
I want to thank that speaker for the speech, and I'd like to give the floor to the second speaker of opening opposition to close the opening half here.
Can you hear me? All right. Three, two, one. First, gonna do some direct rebuttal, then a little bit on the framing, and then a little bit more impacting on our case. The first thing is on who deserves safety. I want to think this to the end, what OG proposes. It's basically, I can afford to buy an alarm from my front door. Paula cannot. Thus, I should be prohibited from buying an alarm because Paula cannot afford it. This would mean that people who, for whatever reasons and circumstances, are able to buy more safety, to be safer, should be not allowed to have that just because there was inequality in those people's lives. Newsflash, this is how the world works. This is oftentimes also how people have voted politicians in based on capitalist systems, or the US has brought them capitalism as in South America. But this thing is, it is what it is, and the people should be, first and foremost, able to protect themselves in order to not lose their lives. This is analysis that Paula gives you that is unresponded to when it comes to who deserves safety. We explained to you, given that we all agree to be part of the state for it to give us rights and that give us benefits, and that also can enact violence on us in the exchange of actual safety. At the moment where they violate this contract, it is not that I have a moral duty to actually give someone to not enact my right of like self-defense in order because someone else also cannot have it. If that was the case, then we should probably talk about whether we should have a massive force form of like taking away their capital and redistributing it, because that would be fairer, because then people could like take this money and do whatever they want with it. What they're saying is they find it okay that some people that are richer might be in danger, might get on the street in the midst of a violent gang fight, that someone might be assaulted because there are people in favelas who cannot afford it, and thus it is justified. I don't think that is a fair justification. I think it's a horrible justification. The second thing is there's spillover effects. They say, oh, the poor and the rich will be a little bit more mixing, or they will be like seeing each other a bit more. No, I think this is in many instances very symmetrical, because these are residential areas that this wall is around, meaning
that for most stuff, whether you want to go to the airport because you want to travel, whether you want to go to the city center to go to a restaurant, whether you want to go shopping, whether you want to meet someone from like another part of town, etc., you still have to travel through the area. I don't understand, like, and the difference is only, do I have to go through a gate to do that, or do I just drive in my car to do that? I think the second thing is that probably like most people still have to go to work somewhere. Most people probably work in a space that is like big and has employees, i.e. a hospital, a university, a factory, services, meaning that they probably, if they get into touch with other people, they mostly get into touch at work, not when they're at home, when they are usually mostly either talking to their neighbors anyway and not really mixing. They have not given us reasons why they would not leave this area. The second thing is, I think to the greatest extent, this is already a collective action problem, meaning if your business is being extorted for safety money that you have to pay to like the cartel that is in charge there, this is something that happens on either side because your business is on their ground, meaning that you have to pay extortion money on either side. If your daughter is being kidnapped because you're a rich dude, that also happens on either side of the house. Meaning I think that a lot of the problems with cartels and drugs, etc., happen on either side of the house. So it's unclear why this is the thing that will then tip it over. Then on gangs and cartels. I think that gangs and cartels already like control areas to a great extent. I think that this is also where the framing now comes in. On flawed democracies, I think that OG highly underestimates how much violence is going on in the areas where these gated communities exist. Note that they missed a crucial link in Paula's framing, which is like, these gated communities probably exist in the places where it's the worst, meaning that you need those gated communities and that they're also most justified. What does this mean? I think that these flawed democracies still have, you know, hospitals, water supplies, electricity that is somewhat centralized. For example, they burn oil, they burn gas, just because even if you're very rich, you might own those, but you cannot build a nuclear factory or have as many solar panels to like have a whole community being attached to it. If what you want is people to use public services, a better model would probably be to like ban private coal generators or something like that. But this is not what you're doing. You're just banning gated communities. The question then becomes, what are the benefits of this law and who do they benefit, and is this benefit justified? I think that given that these flawed democracies oftentimes do have a lot of corruption going on, meaning that people are able to go away with crime, this means that often people prioritize their safety first. What does this mean? This means when they have any amount of money, this is when Paula gives the response to CG, they invested in their safety. This means that they come together as a collective with other people and form those communities because it benefits them. Before I continue, CG, do you have a PI? Okay, OG?
So you can still buy an alarm for your door on either side. It's just that when we're perpetuating a horrible system of inequality and ignorance just so rich people can be paranoid, it's not worth it.
Look, on your side, they already exploit the people that are now supposed to empathize with. Like your characterization says that they use them as workers. If they don't empathize by exploiting them, I don't know why they should empathize by seeing them outside the window of their car. All right. So what are the benefits that we're getting? I think, first of all, you have more safety for these people, and not just actual safety, the feeling of safety. Not that it is actually as a mental quality of life. This also means that the people who are rich, who have resources, are much more willing to stay in these communities and actually pay taxes, even stay in these, meaning that they are willing to invest into a better democratic system because they know that they have to commute to their workplace, but they can live in a safe area where their daughter is safe or where they're not able to go into a gunfight, etc. Meaning that when you have this capital, when you have these people more likely to stay in these areas, you're also more likely to see the prosperity that OG wants to see long term. Because it's not just about actual safety, it's also about a feeling of safety, and it's justified to vote OG.
I want to thank the speaker for his speech. I'd like to give the floor to the first speaker of closing government. Here.
Hey, can you guys hear me? Okay. Boy, oh boy. Okay. 3, 2, 1. 3 extensions in this speech. Firstly is going to be a principle about why this is a just law. Secondly, about why this increases property accessibility. And thirdly, about why this, explaining the contact theory argument that I think OG tries to make, but makes, unfortunately, very generically. So firstly, the principle on why this is a just law. I think there are 2 crucial things that I want to point out. Firstly, is that the reason why it is morally okay to take away these gated communities is precisely the fact that many of the problems that they are designed to solve are caused by the people living in those gated communities and enjoying the benefits of those gated communities themselves. Why is this better than OG's analysis? Because OG makes these kind of like, 2016 Boso things about fucking colonialism or whatever, but the more targeted reason as to why this is principally just a takeaway is because the problems that they want to solve for themselves are the ones that they have created. For example, in a lot of governments in Latin America, the primary way in which the central government gets followers is by handing off state-owned corporations or appointing people to the heads of committees and local councils and things like that. And so they are the ones that are responsible, for example, for the irresponsible policing or for housing policy that is extraordinarily inaccessible, or, for example, the kinds of poor sanitation or poor public services. They are the ones that are directly responsible for those things. And that is why it is immoral that they are the only ones that are able to actually get out of that situation. It is that specific link of moral culpability that means it is immoral for them to escape. But secondly, is the response, and this implicitly responds to OO stuff about why private property is like poggers or whatever, is that we obviously do place limits on private property, right? Okay, intuition pump, and maybe this is just like says more about my political beliefs than anything else, but like it is like on paper fine to be like, yes, you have private property and you buy whatever you want, and can Marina buy an alarm or whatever, things like that. But if you actually examine that claim, there is something that seems fundamentally bad about that. There is something that seems fundamentally unjust and immoral. That is not a world that we would want to live in. That is a world that seems deeply unjust. Because as a society, we do recognize that we do need to place limits on inequality. For example, we have a progressive taxation system. Most jurisdictions in the world have some form of inheritance tax. And it is for that reason. It is because we think that it is morally arbitrary to a large extent the way in which you make that property. And in a civil society, we owe obligations to one another as citizens, that we are incumbent selves that have responsibilities and obligations to those around us, and we are not atomized individuals. And it is in those circumstances that we think that it is fine to place a cap on the ways in which people use their private property. Because yes, if you follow your reasoning down to the logical extent, it's just the conclusion that all taxation is theft, but obviously taxation is not theft. If you believe that, whatever, but it's not, it's obviously not theft because of the reason that we think that there is a moral duty for us to limit inequality. Okay. Secondly, on property accessibility, we increase, by the way, that explains why it is justified to limit private property. OG says why it might be on a utilitarian basis, useful. No, Dylan, I'm not going to take you because I know you will have a response to that. Yeah, OG proves that it is probably useful for people. We do the gap, which is, obviously, if you want to pass a law, it has to be both useful and just. We prove the just part of the argument. Secondly, on property accessibility, 2 reasons why we get better property accessibility. Firstly, it is because gated communities inherently deprive access to communal land and common spaces. For example, a lot like in gated communities, you have like large parks and things like that, and you have communal public spaces that otherwise everyone would be able to enjoy, but then they get subsumed behind the walls of this gated community and are no longer accessible to people. The defining feature of a gated community is that you have walls around it guarded by fucking private security guards that try and shoot anyone that enters. You have deprived people of access to the commons, and we think that is extraordinarily harmful. But secondly, it reduces access to housing. Firstly, because it's now impossible to get any new development in that area, because not only is it the municipal council or whatever that is approving that development, but the private homeowners association that is doing everything to that has been given the power to approve or disapprove of any new housing proposals, which means that they are likely to obviously act in their own selfish interest and deny anything because that would lower their housing value or whatever. But in the comparative, if instead that decision is being made by the municipal council that is responsible for everyone in that area, they are far more likely to think of what is in the common good. But moreover, it means that now you have specific areas that, as OG points out, are able to often set rules for themselves. It means that they are able to dodge housing requirements and housing accessibility requirements that are often mandated in most other areas, but they do not require upon themselves. Like, for example, in many places in Latin America, there are requirements for public housing, or for example, you're not allowed to just have a fucking mansion that takes up heaps of space. There are quotas and legislation in place to improve housing accessibility, but obviously now that it's under the control of a private homeowners association rather than the local government, you are not able to do that. Before I go on, I'll take
Are the children of rich people responsible for their crimes and should therefore just as much be punished as their parents for exploiting?
This is the same argument that people that are sons of colonialists do not have any obligation in reparations to other people. The fact is that we are incumbent selves. We do not just emerge into the world as individuals. We have obligations and we have links of loyalty. If you are proud of your country, you did not oftentimes people have absolutely no logical link to be proud of their country. But the reason we think that nationalism is fine is because we are part of a community that we draw meaning and identity from. You accept that responsibility by being part of that network. I just read a book on this, and I'm probably explaining that very badly, but whatever. Third extension then, why this a contact theory? So basically OG is you go outside and see a poor person and then you're going to fucking donate to charity or vote for Evo Morales or whatever. But this is the actual mechanism. It is that being in a community where there is diversity attacks the crucial narrative that oftentimes rich people say to themselves to justify depriving common access to other people or voting for things that are more progressive, which is that poor people are inherently, by their very nature, people that are bad, people that you should be scared of. The crucial difference on the imperative is then, if you're able to see the conditions that people live in, you're more likely to be able to understand the fact or fight back on that narrative that oftentimes people are driven to acts of desperation or driven to crime, for example, because of the fact that there is insufficient public services or because there's insufficient access to housing, which means that they are more likely to question themselves. Note, we're not saying that everyone is going to become Karl Marx or whatever, but it's that some people on some local councils, some people on some committees, some people that are voting for local government or whatever are going to be more sympathetic to the plight of these people because that narrative upon which hinges their entire political ideology and their entire political stance is, at least we have a hope of attacking. For those reasons, I'm proud to govern.
I want to thank that speaker for his speech, and I'd like to give the floor to the first speaker of closing opposition. Here.
Hi. POIs audibly, please. My chat doesn't work on Zoom. Two extraneous responses to the Gov case before explaining why their policy would destroy native populations and throw people in jail for living in indigenous communities by themselves, which is, for some reason, no one thinks about how these motions actually affect people and populations that aren't just the richest of the rich. We're going to bring this debate into the real world. Two responses to the Gov claim that both teams have, that all public services would get deprivatized and then rich people would improve their public services by lobbying or would have better lives for themselves on their side of the house, on their side. Two responses. First, they concede in OG that the rich feel unsafe in their world, and that's the reason why the rich would lobby and do all this stuff. If rich people feel unsafe and they are rich, it's probably likely that they just move out of the country. Remote work and all this stuff is making it easier than ever for rich people to just leave countries when they feel unsafe, when they feel like they're under threat of attack. If rich people leave, that means you get no tax money, which means both Gov's contingencies about governments having the ability to provide state services and about the ability to provide things like housing goes away because you lose your wealthiest tax base who leave the country. It also means that there is less local. It also means there is less state spending from these rich people who tend to, even if they spend insularly within their communities, you still need apples, which you buy from the farmers in your country, which means you are losing all these people who pay more for the apples in your country, which means the states at these countries and the poor people within these countries who are growing the apples end up losing money. Second response is that rich people only lobby to clean up their own localities. That is, rich people, even if they aren't living in gated communities, they still oftentimes live amongst other rich people because those communities feel safer. Like in America, a lot of rich, with my camera turned off, in America, a lot of rich people live together, and state services in public schools in richer towns and richer zip codes tend to be a lot better than in private neighborhoods. All this goes to show that even if rich are lobbying, they would only lobby to improve services within their localities, which means that it doesn't trickle down to the poorest people, which both gov contingencies rely on. And that's also like the contact theory thing. Yeah, that's also the contact theory thing. Now onto our case, which is that their policy sanctions the booting off of indigenous populations, and so that is unjust, and it like probably better fulfills the principle that CG talked about. First, indigenous populations tend to live in closed-off communities. Two reasons for this. First, because of historical land ties, i.e. a lot of indigenous communities have ties to a particular river where you have a river god or something like this, which means that you and your like the people of your tribe end up staying in one area. And the second reason is because indigenous populations often have like different legal systems that have existed before the government inside of these countries existed, i.e. the Quechua people in Ecuador, they have their own they have their own legislative system, and a lot of indigenous populations have barter and trade systems across South America where they don't use their like local currency. They instead use they don't use the country's currency. They instead just like trade for goods and things like this. These communities and these indigenous communities who live in closed off areas, they would likely be considered gated off communities by the motion for two reasons. First, because states have been looking for ways to displace these peoples for ages, because oftentimes these areas where these indigenous communities live also are resource rich, because these indigenous communities and these tribes set up there in order to be closest to the river or to be closest to this area, which now has a lot of oil, which a lot of oil companies want to buy into. And the average informed voter probably knows cases about like guys in the Amazon that keep getting bullied away by their governments whenever they find any like policy that allows them to do so. And the second reason why they would be considered gated communities is because the states often want legal control over these gated areas, over these indigenous states want the legal control over these indigenous populations, which they don't have now. That is, a lot of these indigenous populations, as I said before, they have their own currencies. The state inside of these the state and the legal order within these areas operates a little bit differently, and these countries want legal control so they can start taxing them and making money off of it and doing that thing that all the things that Gov talked about. Why do states need this type of policy, like this type of like not explicitly anti-indigenous policy? Because I think that's the POI that Gaby's about to say. This type of policy in order to bully indigenous populations, and why is this like the only why is this going to be the policy that is used to do this, and why do they have to do it under the table? Three reasons. First, because most people aren't like crazy racist, so they need this type of language that we are going to ban gated communities instead of ban indigenous communities in order to actually target these people, in order for you to get the votes and get support for these types of policy. Second, because human rights organizations backlash and start a fuss whenever policies are explicitly anti-racist, or anti-indigenous populations, but when ones are sort of anti-indigenous, but you don't know exactly how it could be until the policy is passed, these human rights organizations don't backlash nearly as strongly. And third, because because indigenous groups often have lawyers and things like this, which prevent them from protect these groups from explicitly anti-native policies. But it's much harder when you do this type of under the table thing where you are calling it a gated community, but you're going to treat these indigenous communities as gated communities. How does then banning these indigenous communities from living on their own fuck them over? Two reasons, but before that, I'll take OG's POI, yeah.
Right, so states already displace indigenous tribes, as you say, because they have better justifications like needing resources. The fact is that mansions surrounded by barbed wire are nothing like
you need to keep listening to the rest of my speech. I preempted that, and I said the three reasons that I just gave for why these states often aren't able to do that, because they don't have the political support to do explicitly anti-indigenous policies, because human rights organizations backlash against them, and because indigenous lawyers that protect these indigenous groups oftentimes prevent these policies from passing unless they are hiddenly, implicitly anti-indigenous. All of that means that states can't do it nearly as badly. So why then does this policy really fuck over these indigenous communities? Two reasons, both of them were explicitly in Sam's speech. First, because per PM's speech, you are publicizing all private services. This means you are destroying things like the barter and trade systems that exist. You are destroying things like letting people have access to their own rivers and their own river gods. You are destroying like the religions which are built on the existence of access to these resources and of exclusive access to these resources. And the publicization of these resources means you are ripping these families away from the houses, from like these areas that constitute their understandings of the world. And that's kind of fucked up. And the second reason is because of the response that we got to Dylan's POI to PM, which is that Sam said that this would be enforced by the police and military. Enforced by the police and military sounds a whole lot like throwing a lot of these people in jail for living in communities that they just happen to be born in. I think that's pretty fucked up. This destroys the way of life and like doesn't allow these people, these indigenous tribes, to live in this way that all of their forefathers and all of the other, or the people within their tribes have lived in the past. This beats OG and OO. This beats everyone else actually, because first, these people are more vulnerable. OO's case only affects the rich who can afford to like do all this. And OG's case, these indigenous populations have been bullied a lot per Gaby's POI to me. Second, on magnitude of effect, OO's case is only about marginally improving lives for the rich. OG's case is only about marginally improving state services. CG's contact theory case also only works if you don't throw these populations in jail, which you do, which means that you don't get contact with the indigenous tribes. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his speech, and I'd like to give the floor to the last speaker on the government side. Here.
Thank you. Am I audible? Is this good? Okay, thank you. I'm going to engage with CO, then OO, then weigh against OG. We get two broad things from CO. The first thing is, like at the beginning of their speech, that rich people are just going to move out of the country, and that's going to be incredibly bad for the country. Two responses here. Firstly, guys, like these are the people that have networks that make them rich, that have power over society in these communities. I am unlikely why they're likely to like just pack everything they have, move to America, where they're likely going to be nobodies, and have comparatively worse life. I think even if absent gated community with gated community, you're still going to have a better life in a society over which you have power, in a society over which you can infiltrate political dimensions, and in a society in which you have huge social and political capital. I don't think they're likely to just move just because you ban this. But also, secondly, I just think this is at best symmetric. Like in the status quo, these people are as if they were living in a separate country because they lobby the government to pay incredibly low taxes for them to be able to then self-fund their own schools and hospitals within their gated community that nobody gets access to. I'm just unclear why it's such a huge loss that these people that are anyway just fighting for themselves, not for the whole country, are leaving. This is not really a true impact in this debate. But secondly, the true extension coming out of CO is this idea about how you're going to target gated indigenous communities, and that is just really bad. I have four responses here. The first thing is just like scale. Like empirically, it's true that in more instances, it's about people that are economic rich elites that don't have to do with like indigenous communities divides, no thank you, that live in these gated communities rather than indigenous people. Secondly, then, I think it's just like the comparative. Like if the state is going to want to go against indigenous communities because the majority of the people in society like fucking hate indigenous people, I don't know, then they have the incentive to fuck them over on both sides of the house, regardless of whether you have a gated community or not. I'm just unclear why this exclusively is the one thing that the state can do to fuck in, like indigenous communities over. But also, thirdly, notice I would posit that these are oftentimes like elites of indigenous communities themselves, case in which our analysis equally applies, right? Like if these communities are so expensive to maintain, and if these communities are so expensive to be a part of, then probably it's only the rich people within these indigenous communities that were able to stay in this community. So again, analysis applied, but also badly. I'm unclear what the impact of this whole thing is. Like it's bad to bully indigenous communities is definitely something bad, but it should be weighed against all of the impacts that we provide, which is like a majority of people stay stricken by like violence and incredibly terrible conditions, or the fact that it is entirely illegitimate to favor some people and allow them to get like better lives for themselves at the cost of everyone else. With that in mind, I'm now going to engage with OO, and I'm going to do two broad things here. Firstly, I'm going to talk about who is using these communities and just clarify that's just not the middle class. But also, secondly, then discuss the whole point on legitimacy. There are three reasons why the rich and the upper middle class, and not like, you know, the average Joe, nice working, hardworking middle class, is likely to be using these communities. A, as per their analysis, they're incredibly expensive. Secondly, note that they get exponentially more expensive at the point at which you not only need to be part of the gated community at the beginning, but also obviously then finance your ability to stay within the community, right? Because if the price of the community, if the price of the property within the community increases, and somebody else from outside the community that gets richer, they can outprice you and become part of the community, right? But also secondly, because like the upper middle class in these societies is an incredibly little amount of people. Like even if you get the entire upper middle class and rich class, because of the massive amount of inequality, it means that that's going to be like 5% of the population, where the majority of the people size-wise are still scattered along the lower classes, right? This means, and the bottom line of this is that the people living in this community are, number one, an incredible minority, which is why we're happy to trade off like rights. And also secondly, these people have the huge capacity of change that Aidon talks about. Now let's engage with legitimacy. They make 2 points on legitimacy. The first is that you're justified in building these communities because the state has failed you. The second is that it's not even public space in the first place. Let's debunk each of them. The first is that you're illegitimate in building these communities, in like banning these communities because the state has failed you. 2 responses here. Number one, brother, you are the state in most of these instances, because the way these states work is through incredibly nepotistic networks, right? This means that economic elites, which have just proven to you are going to leave in these communities, are also political elites. How does this work? The mechanism is incredibly simple. In a lot of these countries, there is preferential access to market or preferential rights to like companies within the market dictated by political elites. This means that I am in power and I have a son or like a nephew who has a company that builds like fucking, I don't know, some cement. And then I allow that nephew, or I give them like tax, like, I don't know, subsidies, or I give them preferential benefits to like the company that my nephew owns, which means that I kip into the market my nephew. I know this is a silly example, but the bottom line is you can manipulate through a lot of political power. You can manipulate the market. And this is how things like economic elites become political elites. This means that the state hasn't failed you. It actively helps you in getting what you want. But also, secondly, this is an illegitimate argument because presumably the state has also failed everyone else. Why is it the case that given the state has failed everyone, only you get the capacity to live in like a gated community? The second reason they give for legitimacy is that public space is not public because it has been co-opted by violence previously, and that stripped its character as a public space away. The principled response here is that, sure, violence may have co-opted the space, but there is no point at which OO proves that it is you, as opposed to literally everyone else in society, that gets to claim that space as their private, right? So non-public does not mean you get to claim it as your private. It just means that it's no longer maybe non-public. It doesn't mean that it should be your private or my private or your neighbor's private, right? There is no point at which they establish this need. Before going forward, I'll take a POI from opening if there's any.
Yes. Not all rich people are literal lizard people. And it's not that you are allowed to claim it. It's that people collectively will spend every dollar towards this gated community, even upper middle classes, because it promises them safety.
All right, I'll get into this now. So why is there so much culpability on the part of people living in these gated communities? Because there's this nice analogy of I can afford an alarm, Paula can't, and I cannot, like, is it illegitimate for me to buy my alarm? Here's why it doesn't work. Number one, because you and Paula are probably like in equal economic standing in a developed country, because you and Paula are like one-to-one comparison versus millions of people to hundreds of people. But crucially, you putting an alarm does not harm Paula. Why is this different? Number one, a majority of the people we're talking about have the capacity to change things, both because they own shares to industries or industries themselves, but also secondly, because it's not such a huge compromise, right, for them to change things. It's not such a huge like amount of the money they have. The bottom line here is you lose the right to defend yourself from social violence when you're causing the violence itself. And note that you don't have to be like causing the violence pragmatically, like pay the gunmen that create the violence in society. The fact that you have an established capacity to stop the violence, which doesn't take much out of you, and you don't stop it because you're comfortable living within the gated community, that's what creates a lot of culpability, and that's what creates illegitimacy for you living there. This debate is then incredibly simple. OG gives pragmatic reasons. The entirety of op bench is like, oh, we're never going to debate pragmatics. We're just going to debate legitimacy. We respond to legitimacy. We win legitimacy. This is why, yeah, like all the combinations, I've run out of time. Cheers. Thank you.
I want to thank that speaker for his speech and like to give the floor to the last speaker of closing opposition, and opposition as a whole here.
Opposition can furrow their eyebrows or mouth what to the camera as much as they want. It won't change the fact that across all of history, the worst laws were often harmful, not because of what their stated aim was, but because of their actual implementation. I want you to imagine, and actually imagine this now. Imagine every single person you've ever met in your life. How many people is that? 10,000, 15,000 people at most? Four people, Sam? Okay, imagine that. And imagine every single one of those people was living on a day-to-day insecure position where they didn't know whether their house was going to be secure tomorrow, where they didn't know whether they're going to get clean drinking water, where they didn't know whether they could send their kids to school, whether they didn't know that they're going to be killed tomorrow, whether they didn't know that they could hold onto their house. That would get you somewhere near 0.0001% of the actual population. This is 20 million people. There are 20 million native people in South America at the moment who are in desperate, evil conditions foisted upon them by their governments. And to just say that, oh, it's non-comparative, I think is a faulty response to our case. But I'm going to deal with the rest of the debate because we won that anyway, right? You guys need to start listening to Ari. He gives a lot of really good analysis. Capital flight. Opening government say, right now you are terrified of the poor, existentially so, right? Existentially afraid of the poor. This is their case. They give no analysis as to why you respond to this existential fear of the people in your city by moving into communities within that city. If you've built up all of your life around this thing, they give no analysis as to why you actually stay there. So those who can leave, leave, right? The richest, whose lobbying is providing the money to those countries. The CEOs, right, whose taxes, like federal taxes, are being able to get this money. And those who stay might move into richer neighborhoods with people who look like them, who already have a stronger police presence, who have better electricity and water. Like, Rio has nice places. Like, there's nice communities in Rio, or Belo Horizonte, or Bogota, or whatever you want. Like, there's nice places in these cities. I think there's a really strange conception from proposition that is like gated communities are abject poverty, and their cases are reliant on it. What does this mean for the debate? 5 things. Firstly, existing capital for state services is decreased because you have to redistribute it across more people. Gaby says this in DPM. Their case is reliant on overcoming that, but they can't. Secondly, they will not lobby for solutions because they will not face the same problems. Ari said this, no response. Third thing, integration effects will also not happen because you're not interacting with the poor. CG's claims and OG's claims are based off conceptions of the poor. You're going to operate with the middle class in that country who also have bad opinions on the poor. Fourthly, lobbying where it happens is reduced. And also this happens through corrupt state services. And they also have perceptions of the poor as freelancers or like freeloaders and that kind of thing, because you might not even lobby for the benefits, even if it's in your interest, if this is so catalytic a fear that you have. Fifthly, as they say, oh yeah, they were just not going to lobby for these solutions. So opening government and closing government's practical claims here are pretty muted. I'll deal with the specific stuff outside of this in a little bit. But the point of this analysis is that if they cannot prove that the money stays in the country, they cannot prove that the money is put towards good uses in those countries. The responses we heard to this from government whip were twofold. Firstly, oh, they have existing networks here. Ari told you this. Like, Ari preempted this argument. He said that it's become increasingly easy to operate your businesses from abroad. Many CEOs don't live in the countries where their things take place in. Like Bill Gates operates a lot of countries across the world. He doesn't live in every single country. You can run these corporations from afar. Not every person is going to be running a country. You can move to these different places, and you have a horrific fear of these people. That means you want to evade them at all costs. So that doesn't work. The second thing they say is it's non-comparative because, oh, they aren't spending money anyway. They're only spending money within their own communities. I already told you this. They pay federal taxes, even if they pay local municipal taxes as well. They pay federal taxes or corporation taxes. And they also spend money on things in the economy, right? They buy apples, they buy a watch. And maybe if the fancy watch guy might be living outside the community and then he buys bread and that bread is bought by the bread maker. Like, all these things happen and the money does stay in the economy to some extent. So this is really important for the debate and it wins the debate. But I'm going to go on to legitimacy or CG's claims now as well. The legitimacy claim obviously is beaten by our claim because it's premised on you being for the natives. It's premised on you being responsible for these conditions that have been foisted upon you and providing solutions, 2 things which we provide answers to. Accessibility. Again, accessibility is beaten by our claims to do with the fact that you will not be able to have the money for new developments if you don't have that same amount of money in the economy because of capital flight. And the contact theory thing I've already dealt with in a different claim. Notably, the legitimacy claim also wins the debate for us anyways, because the logical corollary of you should be able to, give up things that are unjustly given to you towards others means that people should be responsible for their own status and are not responsible. People should be given what they deserve in life. They shouldn't be punished for things that aren't their fault, which is the case for natives in this instance. Now, native rights. 20 million people again, 20 million people. So for the response we got from proposition for both these things was, I think, the lazy response that Rehan fucking preempted when he said that, look, there's reasons why you have to go through backdoor policies. Like, the GOP in America hates trans people, but they don't ban trans people. They ban like sex education. The GOP hates black people, but they don't ban black people. They ban critical race theory. Like, there's moderates in these countries who won't vote for these policies unless they're riled up by the kind of populistic fervor we've heard from proposition bench thus far to do with the people who are scapegoated within these gated communities. The claims that opening government give on their model, and this is the only thing we can take to be realistic in the debate, what they actually model, right, is 4 things. No private provisioning of state services, which means extra state healthcare and like local infrastructures are now going to be undermined. Second, and you can rely on the state then, that's really bad. Secondly, no private security, so you can't defend yourself, and if you defend yourself, you'll be drawn up in court. Thirdly, you can't bar entry, so it's easier for private firms to go in and essentially colonize the local land, take the resources, build a pipeline, whatever. And fifthly, mandatory, and this is the claim thing, mandatory like housing in those areas for external groups. So you can just literally move in. These communities can't protect themselves. So the ExxonMobil guys can send their workers in to start living in these areas and work in these areas, and there's nothing that they can do about it. You need to do backdoor means for all the reasons that Ari gave you and got no response. I'm going to take a point of information from opening government.
So Indigenous reserves don't even have gates. How is the state's only justification for bullying them a policy targeted at mansions with their own...
Okay, sorry, I don't mean to be mean, but your policy, as you outlined it extensively, banned 4 things which are intended to affect gated communities. So your way to ban gated communities outlined banning private provisioning of state services, no private security for local areas, not being able to bar entry to certain places, and mandatory locations for external groups. Those 4 things in your policy will be used for other means. That's our case. You're adding laws to you can't just ban gated communities. You can't write a law that says we ban gated communities. You write laws that note the things that you say there and then are used on the ground for people. If they fight back, of course, to be faced with prison and state-sanctioned violence, they will lose every single case they will ever take about land control. They will have to buy out of state services because they can't go to their local healer anymore, but they also won't go to a hospital or they'll get severely mistreated by racists in that area, and the land that they have will be lost. Why is this win the debate? Opening opposition talk about the justification of private property. It's premised off of no alternatives, which we proved to an actual group who has fewer alternatives. Secondly, a duty to yourself, which even if you don't buy that, we have a duty to other people as well, so we help that out. And thirdly, based off of self-defense, this is an existential form of self-defense for these people because it affects their lives, their livelihoods, and all those things. Whereas for opening opposition, they can move to relatively safe communities, so the comparative is smaller. Against opening government, we're able to defeat their practical claims, but at least throw enough mud on them that the lives and security of 20 million people should significantly weigh against. Closing government, we sufficiently responded to earlier. Panel, you have to care about laws as they are implemented in the world, not just what they say on paper. That's what closing opposition tell you. We're very proud to oppose.
So Ida, you're good to work. Yeah, cool. Okay. Then I think everybody also joined in the meantime. So let's just give the floor to the Prime Minister. Here.
Cool. My internet is a bit finicky at the moment, so if all the speakers could turn off their cameras, that would be much appreciated. Thank you. Sorry about that. Great. Yeah, just give me the POIs in chat, whatever. You know the drill. My timer. Let's start. Currently, all over South America, we see the same patterns of rich people within society after having made it, after having accrued their own fortunes, oftentimes through illegitimate and exploitative means, drawing up the bridge behind them, retreating in gated communities with privatized public services, with private schools, and taking all that they've plundered from society into their own little fortresses of prosperity. We think that prosperity and that engagement in civic life needs to be shared with society writ large. This is why we need to intervene. This is why we need to strengthen the fabric of civic societies all over South America. How do we make this motion? Quite simply, there's 3 things we will enforce in every city, every country, and every municipality. Which is that A, there is to be no private provisioning of state services, e.g. things like ambulances, like waste collection, like water provisioning, like electricity provisioning has to come from the state and may not happen through private services. Secondly, we say that there is not to be a private provisioning of security that interferes with police operations or replaces police operations. The security that you get is the security that society jointly in the form of a government has established. And thirdly, we say, well, obviously you can't randomly bar people from coming into a certain part of town. But part of this is also that we say, well, have a minimum public of housing quota, and a minimum quota of public housing that needs to be present in every district of a city. So you can't just have like a corridor only for rich people. If you wanna have a bunch of villas around it, like 5 to 10% of the population need to be within public housing. If OO has a clarification question, I'll take it. Otherwise, not.
Yes. In what world do
Go.
you have fiat to completely change the war, like drug cartels and failing democracies in South
Look,
America?
My guy,